We'll sing the first and last verses of this song. Really don't need to start this one, right? Lean on mighty arm of Jesus.
Psalm 102 is where we're going to be tonight, and we go from there. Psalm 102. I think those of us who have lived any amount of time know what it's like to feel alone. To have that sense of being destitute and alone, and even in a crowded room of people, we can still feel just this inner sense and ringing of loneliness. And it's even in a room filled with people that you love and you know that they love you, but yet at the same time you still just feel alone. That's what makes emotions are such peculiar things sometimes, right? They can make you feel certain ways, and they can make you think certain things and make things all the more difficult. And loneliness is one of those strange words. It can do some serious things to you. And in those moments of loneliness, when we're looking around and we're wondering, you feel like no one else is with you, even though somebody might be in proximity to you. You're having, and many times you're having thoughts that you feel like you can't really talk to people about. You're just not really sure even how to sometimes verbalize what it is that you're feeling. And so it gets difficult in those moments because, number one, you struggle with the feeling, but number two, even if I went to talk to somebody about it, who would that person be? And next, whatever in the list, how would I even go about saying it? Because I don't even know exactly what's going on myself. And so loneliness becomes all the more difficult. And in those moments, at least in my own life, I have found that there is this temptation to not pray in those moments. Because you can get so down just in the how you feel in that moment that you just kind of say, what's the point? Why? I mean, but you see, that's the thing about emotions. You know in your head that God cares. But sometimes being able to make that journey from your mind to your heart and your emotions is a long journey. And so we have to figure out how to do that. And so even when we're tempted in moments like that to turn away and maybe not even pray at all, I've found that in the moments where I don't feel like praying, those are the moments that I should pray the most. Because they will force me to wrestle with what it is that's bothering me and to take them to the only one who can truly understand them, even in the moments when I cannot understand them myself. And so tonight I thought we would look at Psalm 102, which is, we will call it the prayer of the destitute, and that comes from verse 17 of this psalm. He regards the prayer of the destitute and does not despise their prayer. Now, concerning the circumstances of this psalm, it's kind of difficult to know exactly what's going on. Some of the psalms, it's pretty simple to know the historical backdrop of what is happening. David is fleeing from Absalom or something along those lines, and we can kind of put it in a location and figure out what's going on. We can kind of dissect and see something like Psalm 46. That psalm is written to the background of an Assyrian invasion that surrounded Judah, and it looked as if they weren't going to survive that Assyrian invasion. And then God miraculously delivered them with an angel destroying 185,000 Assyrians in a night. And so it helps us to really see the psalm for what's going on. But this one is a little bit tougher. There seems to be an element to it of national tragedy, because there is this idea of having pity on Zion in verse 13. So is this something that is much bigger, that has happened to the city of Jerusalem, the people of God, and that the emotions that are addressed in the first 11 verses, are they just personified? Are the people of God seen as one person feeling all of these things? Or is this one person's experience as they've gone through all these things? It's a little bit tricky and difficult to know exactly what is going on. But the one thing that all of those judgments have in common is that whether this represents a large group of people, or whether it represents a person with a national tragedy, or even with elements that are difficult on the front, just difficult for that person's circumstances, that the emotions and the message remain the same. And so it's to that we want to focus tonight. Pay attention to those emotions and that message to help us, and no matter what the circumstance may be. Now, to examine the psalm, and we won't get to look at every verse, but we will look at a majority of them. I want us to break it into three parts. The first two verses, we want to look at the cry of the psalmist, because that's what he's doing. He's crying out to God. And then number two, in verses 3 through 11, we want to look at what his complaint is, what it is that's bothering him, and how he's feeling in the circumstances. And then in verses 12 to 28, which we will pick just a handful of verses out to kind of help us get some thoughts, I want us to talk about what it is and how he comes to understand the care of God in the midst of his loneliness. So first of all, let's think about his cry. Now notice that you have in Psalm 102 a superscription. These are not necessarily inspired. They're put there by scholars that are living a couple of centuries before Jesus. But I want you to pay attention to these words, because it's a very good characterization. These weren't just written by people in an offhand observation. These were written by people who knew what they were doing. Okay? So it says, a prayer of the afflicted, or literally the depressed, when he is faint and pours out his complaint before the Lord. To be clothed in and to be overwhelmed with what's going on, and then to pour out his complaint before the Lord. It's very similar to the language that's used of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1. When the other wife of her husband is tormenting her because she cannot have children. And you remember she goes into the tabernacle area and is praying to God, and Eli believes that she is drunk. And she returns back because he thinks she's drunk because she's praying and her lips are moving, but nothing audible is coming out. Okay? Many of us have prayed that way many times. And so he thinks that she's drunk. And she says, no, this is nothing but bitterness of spirit, because I've been pouring out my soul before the Lord. And it's a very vivid image that where you take a bottle of water or a container of a liquid and you're just pouring it out in front of God. And so the idea is that you're taking all of your emotions, you're taking all that you are, and you're just kind of letting yourself go and just let it fall And that's what the psalmist is doing here. So number one, under this idea of a cry, he asks for some liberty in this process. He says, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry come to you." In essence, if you were to summarize, what he's saying is he's asking God for the liberty to offer a complaint. He's not necessarily, and listen, there is a complaining that is sinful, and there's a complaining that's not sinful. Okay, so you have a complaining that's sinful. You look at like the book of Numbers, where they're complaining about God's provision. They're casting God in negativity as they talk about their situation, which He has rescued them. That's a sinful complaint. But there's also a complaint or a lamentation that is just, where we're coming to God and saying, "This is who I am." We're not accusing God of anything. We're not blaming God for anything. We're just saying, this is how it is. This is how I feel in this moment. And so that's what he's saying. Let me have permission to lay my complaint before you, to lay my situation in front of you. And then in verse 2, he breaks in and we see three different things. The first thing he asks in verse 2 is for God to look at him. "Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress." Now, to hide the face of God was, we use the word look, but it's actually a lot more than just looking in the sense. When he's not just saying, "God, look at me when I'm talking to you," although there is that sense of wanting God to look at him and that personal connection that exists. But the idea of God's face is pictured of blessing and curse. Let me see if I can illustrate this. 1 Peter chapter 3. Where it says, "The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and His ears are opened into their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those," or turned away from those who do evil. Or in Numbers chapter 6, when he's talking about the blessing of God, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord be gracious unto you. May He lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace." His countenance, His presence, His face. And so the idea of God's face being toward an individual is the idea of fellowship and intimacy and protection, even in certain circumstances. But when God turns His face away, that's the idea of rejection. Okay? So when the psalmist says, "God, don't hide your face from me. Let my cry come to you and don't hide your face from me," that is, don't abandon me in the midst of this. I already feel this way. Don't take away your fellowship from me. And so he's bringing this complaint to him and asking God to place His protective eye upon him in the midst of his distress, his narrowness, his tight place. Then he asks for God to listen to him. "Incline your ear to me." The idea is to bend away, is what the word means. And so it's the idea of really, now, I realize I'm only 34? I look a lot older. I'm missing a lot of hair. I can't see without my glasses on very well. I don't hear very well. I never really have been a good hearer. And that's not, some people say, "Oh, it's selective." No, it legitimately is not, okay? I cannot hear. And so sometimes when someone is trying to, especially maybe in a counseling situation or someone where I really need to pay attention to every word someone is saying, I have to kind of lean in a certain way, especially if the person's voice is soft, to make sure that I can hear. Position myself just right so that I can hear. And so that's kind of what the psalmist is asking here for God. Now, God, of course, is not hard of hearing, but it's the idea of giving the utmost attention, that you would listen very carefully to what it is that I'm feeling and what it is that I'm saying in this particular moment. And then more than that, he's asking God to lift him out of this situation. "Answer me speedily in the day when I call." I want it to be answered. I want God to take it away. Now, we've been through enough of these Psalms and enough of things that are similar to them, like Habakkuk and other things, to know that God isn't always going to necessarily take it away at the time in which we would desire it. But there's nothing wrong with saying to God, "This is an overwhelming circumstance, and I want it to leave me alone. I want it to go away. And I know you can take it away." And so that's what he's doing here. He's asking God for the liberty to lay these things out in front of him. and to explain how he feels and for God to listen to him and be attentive to him. Because when you feel like you're alone, you don't really feel like you can go to anybody with this. And now you need God to be that person for you. So, now he's going to lay out his complaint before him. Number 1, verse 3. The first part of verse 3. He says, "For my days pass away like smoke." That is, his days feel pointless. Smoke has really no substance to it, right? It is carried along very quickly. It moves away. And so there's not really a lot of substance to it. So he says, I feel like my days sometimes are just pointless. It's just passing by quickly, and it just feels pointless. Why am I getting up today? Why am I going to work today? I'm not going to make any difference. Now again, this is the emotional side talking to you, right? It's not reality, but it's the emotional side. But you can feel as if, why am I going to bother? Teachers, why am I going to school today? Why am I going to try? This kid is just going to give me problems. It's going to be a repeat, the same old thing over and over again every day. I'm going to have to deal with this person, deal with this problem, deal with that problem. Why bother? What's the point? So you can feel, and the psalmist here feels, just seems kind of pointless. It just passes away. There's no real substance to it. Then he says that my bones burn like a furnace. So I would characterize that statement by something like powerlessness. All translations are pretty uniform in the idea that it's the bones being burned. And one of the ideas behind that may be it's like your skeletal structure has been burned, and basically your bones have been reduced to ash. And so if you tried to stand up, you tried to get out of bed in the morning, you would just kind of collapse the way ash would. If you tried to put the pressure of your body on bones made of ash, it would just... And so it's kind of like the idea of I'm kind of helpless in this situation, but also carries with it the same idea of the previous section of being pointless. You know, if I get out of bed, I'm not going to be able to go anywhere. I don't really want to get out of bed. And so he's really struggling with what's going on, as you can see. And you will notice, I think, very easily that when you examine this text in 1 Samuel 1 and a ton of other texts in Scripture, that you've got a pretty textbook characterization of depression. I mean, I don't think that's a far leap. You've got a lot of things going on here. Then in verses 4 and 5, he says, my heart or my emotions are struck down like grass and have withered. So, my heart is struck down like grass that would be vibrant in the morning and scorched by the sun in the evening. And so absolutely gone, struck down here today, gone tomorrow, it has withered, that I forget to eat my bread. I don't even remember to eat. It just kind of, sometimes you can feel like you're just a passive participant. Many years ago, I was, there's an anxiety disorder runs in my family, and it hit me when I was about 20 years old. And I've taken medicine for it since I was 20 and probably will to the day I die. But one of the things that it can do to you is it can kind of make you just kind of feel like a zombie. What happens is you stress your emotions to the point where you're just kind of, like you see things happening around you, but you don't really feel like you're a participant in it. You're just kind of, and it's really difficult to explain if you've never experienced it, but it's a peculiar feeling. And it's not one, thankfully, there are plenty of things now that can regulate it and it can help it, and I've only experienced it maybe 2 or 3 times in the 15 years I've had it. But you just kind of feel like you're a passive participant, and you just don't think. And so you can forget to do things like eat. Especially when you're in the throes of a depressive state here, you get into that pointless idea. And everything seems pointless, so you forget to eat your bread. But your heart is struck down, your emotions are just shot. And basically, and that's why we describe this section as being emotionless. Because your emotions are so worn out, they just have to shut down, is what happens. Okay? And so you can't really feel anything. And that goes into what is said in verse 5. Because of my loud groanings or my complaints, my bones cling to my flesh. There may be the idea behind that. There's a couple possibilities. One could be the idea of weight loss, bones cling to the flesh. One could be the idea of just life kind of is a burden, that your bones can't sustain the weight of your body, your flesh. And so you just become emotionless. You just get real. Now again, what it is that has this psalmist like this, we don't know. But he's very seriously struggling here. Then he tells God that he feels friendless. I'm like a desert owl of the wilderness, like an owl in the waste places. The wilderness, obviously a place of desolation. You're not going to find a lot of people there. You're not going to have conversations there. Or as he says in the second part of the refrain, an owl in the waste places. The picture is you have an old abandoned city that's been ruined and nobody lives there. And he said, I feel like that owl that just sits there. I just feel alone. I feel like I don't have a friend. Now, here's something that we have to understand to really catch the full weight of what's being said. Many of the people that we consider friends actually should be characterized more as acquaintances. Acquaintances are people that you can talk about a lot of things. Hey, how are you? How's your family? Blah, blah, blah. How's this? Blah. That's an acquaintance. There's nothing wrong with that. But friendship is something that's far deeper. Friendship is being able to look at the person and say, you know what? I'm just having an off day today. I'm worried that I'm not being a good father right now. I'm worried that I'm not being a good husband right now because I have a lot of things going on and I'm stressed about those things. When you can start talking about the deepest things of your heart, that's friendship. Everything else is just acquaintance. And if you don't have that, if you don't have someone with whom you can share your life, that's very difficult because that leads you into this moment of isolation where you're saying, what's the point? I mean, I can't talk to this person, I can't talk to that person, nobody really cares and bothers to listen. I mean, people are nice and that's fine, but it doesn't help me in this situation. And so he, in this moment, feels friendless. Even in a room full of people, he still feels like he's just an owl in an old abandoned city. Because you see, one of the other differences between a friend and an acquaintance is to acquaintances, you may look as if everything is okay. A true friend can look at you and they can say, everything looks okay, but to use an old phrase, the sparkle in their eye that makes them who they are, it's not there right now. There's something bothering them. And so you have that sense of friendlessness, no one to turn to. Then, in verse 7, that turns into sleeplessness. I lie awake and I'm like a lonely sparrow on the housetop. I'm struggling, and so your thoughts and your emotions are just running wild and all over the place, and you go to bed at night and you think that's the one place, at least I can go to sleep and sleep it off. But then that's when it gets really quiet, right? And that's when your mind can start thinking again. And there is literally nothing to interrupt it. So you lose sleep and you play the scenario and you play the situation and you examine the things that are going on, except you're exhausted from the process of the day and you're exhausted in your emotions and you're exhausted thinking about everything, and yet you continue to spin it even more when you try and go to sleep. Verse 8, there's a feeling of being defenseless. All day long my enemies taunt me. Those who deride me use my name for a curse. There is a special degree of loneliness that can overtake a person when you have to stand up for something that is right and people don't like that, and then people start coming after you for that. There is a special sense of loneliness that comes in that moment that is really, really hard to understand. And to have people that use your name and they cast it down and they deride it to other people, that's a hard thing to carry. And especially when, because you are who you are, you're not going to step up and return evil for evil. Because you're a Christian and we have an ethic of Jesus that says we don't return evil for evil. When a person over here runs us into the ground, we sit back and we just let it run its course because that's not who we are. We don't get involved in a mud fight because everybody ends up with mud on them. That's not who we are. And so you feel defenseless. Nobody's standing up and speaking for this particular psalmist. Then he says, my life is joyless. I eat ashes like bread and mingle tears with my drink. Ashes were used as a symbol of mourning. They would put them on the top of their head. And so ashes being eaten as bread is a metaphorical way of saying that mourning just overtakes them. It's like they eat it. And that the tears are mingled with a drink. The idea of when you go to drink, you're crying and tears just kind of flow down into your cup. There's just deep-seated hurt. Verse 10, there's also a feeling of helplessness. Because of your indignation and anger, for you have taken me up and thrown me down. Now this phrase, if this is a national incident, this could be something that Israel has sinned and God has punished them, and so they're feeling the weight of God's punishment upon them. Or it could be that the psalmist is simply saying, God, I have racked my brain about this situation, and maybe the reason why this is happening to me, maybe the reason why I'm this way is because I'm not who I'm supposed to be. Maybe it's because I'm not who you expect me to be, and I'm bearing punishment because I'm not who you expect me to be. You see, because when you get caught in the throes of something, you're looking for any kind of answer. And for Christians who are conscious of their relationship with God, one of the things they will ask themselves is, is this because I'm not who I'm supposed to be? Is there something was I supposed to be better? Would that have prevented this? Now again, those are emotions. That's not reality. Bad things happen to good people. We understand that in our minds. But really, verse 11 really characterizes it when he says, my days are like an evening shadow and I wither away like grass. It just seems hopeless. I'm just not going to get any better. I don't think I'm going to make it out of this one. And that's a hard feeling to bear. When you're really trying in a situation and it just doesn't look like it's going to get any better. And you don't, because you're alone, you don't have a person who can come to you like Jonathan did to David in the wilderness and say to him in the midst of his difficulty, I know that you're going to be king. You're going to survive all that my Father is putting you through, and things are going to go well with you. But you don't have that because you can't turn to someone because you're alone. And so you think it's never going to get better. So what do we do in that moment? And this, personally speaking, this is what I've found to be the hardest thing to do, but the only thing that can be done. And that is, you have to sit down. You have to open your Bible and you have to challenge your emotions. This is how I feel. But are those feelings being deceptive? Are they magnifying and overemphasizing something that's distorting what is reality? And so basically what is happening is this: as long as I remain by myself alone and I'm spinning all of these narratives and these stories and these situations in my head alone, then the only information I have is what? The narrative that I'm spinning in my head. And that is like being on a hamster's wheel. You will spin that thing until you die. So at some point, you've got to introduce an outside force that can halt that spin and challenge it. You've got to bring something in that can challenge that thought and that wheel that you feel like you're on. And that's what the psalmist does here, because he's going to see some things about God, bring it in to kind of challenge that thought. So when that hamster wheel decides it wants to get going again, you can put your hand on it and stop it and say, but God. This is how I feel, but this is what reality really is. And so here are 4 of them quickly. Number 1, he focuses in on we put God's presence on the screen, but really carried with this idea is God's permanence and also his power. Look at verse 12. He says, "But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever, and you are remembered throughout all generations." Verse 24. "O my God, I say, take me not away in the midst of my days, for though you whose years endure throughout all generations, of old you've laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will wear out like a garment, and you will change them like a robe, but you are the same, and your years have no end." There's a lot of things that can be said about this, because this is something that deals with what we call God's immutability, his unchangeableness. But the things I want to zero in on are the fact that, number 1, that God is present. God is eternal. God goes nowhere. He's unchangeable. He's in the place that he's always been. And he's in the place that he will always be. But also there's a focus on his power. Notice he says the heavens, you've strung them up like a curtain rod. And when you get tired of them, the same way, as easy as it is for you and I to take off the shirt we're wearing because we're ready to put it in the dirty clothes and put on another one, it's going to be that simple for you to end this world and do whatever you want to do. That's power. And so when you focus in on the presence and the power of God, that although I feel alone, I have to challenge my thoughts of loneliness with the fact of God's presence. That God is with me. And that I'm not enduring whatever it is I'm enduring alone. And I have to put God's power and balance out and say, because the situation seems so overwhelming, it seems hopeless, it seems like nothing good is going to come out of it, but I look at God and say, but if you can string up the heavens like a curtain rod, and you can change them like I change a shirt, what does that mean you can do with my situation? Think about that. If he can string out our heavens like they're nothing, and change them and destroy them as simply as you and I change a shirt, what can he do then with the situation that I feel is hopeless? Well, surely he can change it and turn it. And so we have to understand and know the presence of God in those moments. That's what he's clinging to, Hebrews 13, 5 and 6. Number 2, you see God's pity. It's spelled out in verse 13. You will arise and have pity on Zion. And it is, he says, it is time to favor her. And that is the idea that God knows how I feel. And that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind, because when you're in that sense of loneliness, you look at other people and you think, but nobody really understands how I feel. I had a friend many years ago that when we were preaching in the same area at the time, and when we would go through difficulties and different just challenges of things, I'll never forget the way that he would pray. When he would begin his prayer, he would say, God, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing it, obviously much more reverent than this, but we're coming to you and we've got a problem. Now, we know that you know what the problem is. We know that you know how long it's going to last. We know that you know how it's going to be solved. And we know that you know how we're going to be taken care of. And there's something about when he prayed that way, it helped shrink our problems into perspective. But here I am, torn to shreds, but God knows exactly what's going on. He knows how it's going to turn out. And furthermore, he knows exactly how I feel. As a matter of fact, sometimes he would say, you know this situation better than we do. And you know how we feel better than we do. Help us to see it the way you see it. Because even us, even though we understand all of the things that are spinning around in our heads, we're still flawed human beings. And we still have emotions that can distort reality. But God can see things very clearly for what they are. And he can feel our hurt. And because of that, we can take comfort that even if nobody else in the world may understand, and I may not be able to talk to anybody else about what's going on, I can talk to God and know that he not only knows how I feel, he actually understands everything about it perfectly. And he knows that it's not going to last forever. He knows exactly when it will end. He knows exactly how it will get better. And he knows which of my feelings are legitimate and which of them are not based in reality. Number 3. God is perceptive. As we said in the beginning, he regards the prayer of the destitute and does not despise their prayer. He is attentive. He listens. He heard the prayer of the destitute. More than just, and the idea behind here, you see with Hebrew, Greek and Hebrew, Greek in the New Testament, Hebrew in the Old Testament, Greek is very detailed. It's got a very large vocabulary. So you have words that are very specific in their meaning. Hebrew has a smaller vocabulary. And so words take on a much broader meaning. And so, for an example, with the word hear, right here. You remember in the Old Testament, God commands us to hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Deuteronomy 6, the Shema. That word carries with it the idea of letting it come into your ear, but it carries with it much more than that. Because Hebrew is so broad in its understanding, it also carries with it the idea of not just hearing it, but of believing it and obeying it. You remember God will say through the prophets, I called to you and you did not hear me. Does it mean they didn't literally hear his voice? No. They refused to obey it. They refused to listen. And so here has with it a pretty broad range of possibilities. And so when it says that he hears the prayer of the destitute, there's certainly the first side of it, that you have someone who's willing to listen to us. Because I'm going to be honest with you, there are certain types of people in this world that when you take your problems to them, and you have to learn very quickly who you can and can't talk to certain things about. There are some people that, bless their heart, all they know how to do, they just want to fix things. And so you start talking about your problems and they're already putting together this extravagant formula of how you're going to solve it. We're going to get better in 7 steps. I'm going to tell you something. For most people, that's not what we need. Then you've got other people who know how to just sit and listen and just let you hurt. Because there's something that comes from you just pouring that out to another person. And so with God, we have someone who will sit and just listen. He will listen to the hurt. And so he will hear in that sense, but he will also hear in the sense that he will solve our problems. Even if not in this moment solve them, he will ultimately solve them. And because of that, that leads then to this final roundabout. God should be praised. In verses 18 to 22, he says, "Let this be recorded for a generation to come, so that a people yet to be created may praise the Lord." By the way, that would be those of us who are reading this right now. "That he looked down from his holy height from heaven, and the Lord looked at the earth to hear the groans of the prisoners, to set free those who were doomed to die. That they may declare in Zion the name of the Lord, and in Jerusalem his praise, when peoples gather together in kingdoms to worship the Lord." That is, God's deliverance, God's help of the psalmist as he struggled would be something for which God would be praised and would encourage other generations. How many generations of people have been encouraged from just the message of Psalm 102 since the second it was penned? And so ultimately, God is praised. And so when we're in these moments, when we feel destitute and we're offering our prayer to God, and we see the greatness of God and help us to put our issues in perspective of the greatness of God and his ability and his care and his presence to walk with us through them and to solve them and to bring us out safely on the other side, you can actually find at the end of the prayer that what started as a feeling of such lowness now ends how? In the heights of worship. And that's what we need in destitution. When we feel destitute, we need our God back. And we need to put these things in perspective and end not being emotionless anymore, but being filled with wonder and praise and worship. And so as we think about these things that happen to us, I would encourage you to have certain texts that you use regularly. You know, there are days in devotional times where we're going through, say, our study plan. But I'm going to tell you the truth. There are some days when I walk into my office, my heart is just in a different place. And it's not going to be Proverbs today. It's going to be the portion of Scripture that has helped me in this same situation and in this same feeling. It has helped me many times before, and I'm going there. Have those texts that help you get reoriented when those moments come, and run to them and let them lead you. Tonight, if you are struggling with things in life, we would love to pray with you. I believe and have always believed that the invitation is not just a time for people to simply confess sins or to make their confession known because they want to be baptized into Christ. All good things. Not denigrating that whatsoever. But you know, I just believe that the invitation is also a time for people who hurt. And when you look at the New Testament church, the way that they shared their lives together, they didn't hide their hurts from each other. Didn't mean you aired out every detail. But if I can't take my hurts to people who love Jesus, this world becomes a dark place. So maybe tonight someone's hurt is because of their sin. The penitent faith that confesses Jesus to be immersed in water, he'll solve that problem. Or maybe it's because we've gone back into sin to pray together. Repentance and prayer solves that problem. Or maybe we're just struggling. We need to pray together. Maybe I don't feel comfortable doing it publicly. Let's talk about it privately. Whatever it is, we just want to try and help one another in this process. So we can help you tonight. Let us know as we stand and sing this song.